Most of the plants that we're growing in our vegetable garden will grow just fine in 8 to 15 inches of soil. So when we grow in raised beds, it's really only the top part of amended soil that it's growing our plants. We have lots of options for the bottom half. Join me today as I show you how I fill my raised beds and save money in the process. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I do a lot of gardening in raised beds. One of the benefits to raised beds that I like most is that I can fill it with good soil. And that makes a big difference for me because my native soil is pretty poor. Not only is it compacted and lacking in organic matter, but it's also lacking in the major nutrients that plants need. I can make a raised bed and fill it with good soil and begin planting right away. Now, one of the disadvantages to raised beds is that you have to fill it with soil, and that soil can be expensive. I'm willing to take the expense to build the beds, but I'm not so willing to pay for soil just to fill the bed. Even accounting for the recent increase in the price of lumber, you can build a wooden raised bed for less than it would cost you to fill that same bed with bagged potting soil that you would buy from a big box store. I just finished this major garden project to build a series of raised beds for this enclosed garden area. And to fill these beds would take more than 12 cubic yards of soil. And even by buying that soil in bulk, like I do for $45 to $50 a cubic yard, it's still hundreds of dollars to fill these beds. Well, I'm willing to work hard and make a little extra effort to fill the bottom portion of these beds and save me some big expense. I do this by using the proven method of Hugelkultur, something that's practiced by gardeners all over the world. And the basic idea is to take logs and branches and twigs and wood chips and other woody material and layer it in the bottom of the bed. It's adding organic matter to the soil, and it's filling a space that would otherwise have to require some other type of expensive material like amended soil. Over time, the logs and the branches break down and add nutrients to the soil. They also act like big sponges. So at the bottom of your beds, you have these big decomposing logs and branches that will absorb the water and release it back into the soil. It ultimately requires less water in a bed that you're using Hugelkultur in, and it requires fewer nutrients over the long run because of that material that you're adding to the soil. I've used this modified Hugelkultur method in all of my raised beds. Now, you could just fill the bottom of the bed with a bunch of rocks or gravel or concrete chunks, but I like the idea of having an open interface between the native soil and the soil in the bed. Without even trying, all of these beds now have earthworms in them because that open space beneath these beds allow all of the soil organisms to move freely. And so as earthworms move around my landscape, they discover these beds, tunnel up into the beds, and help enrich the soil. You really don't get that if you fill the beds with something like rock and concrete. The basic process is very easy. Whatever organic material you have, you can use it to fill the beds. If you have big logs, use big logs. If you have branches, use branches. Twigs, leaves, pine needles, all of that can be used for the lower part of these beds. And that's exactly what I did here. I had some big logs from a tree that had been cut down, and I put all of that in as my base layer. It took time, but once I ran out of logs, I then began filling the space with other branches. I still used big branches, but they were smaller than the logs and allowed me to fill some of that space in between. And I continued this process, adding more logs, more branches, more twigs, and I had a bunch of wood chips. So I poured wood chips on top of all of that to fill up some of that space as well. I used the different size materials to try to fill the gaps as much as possible. So whatever you're using, try to avoid big air spaces, because when you do put the soil on top, well, that soil is going to settle down into those air pockets, and the level of the surface is going to drop dramatically. Also, depending on what material you use, some of it's going to decompose at a faster rate. So those big logs are going to take years to break down, but the smaller twigs and wood chips and leaves are going to decompose pretty quickly. When I filled this bed, I used primarily twigs and small branches. And 1 year later, this surface level had dropped about 5 inches. Some of that was because of the air pockets that were filled by the soil, but much of it was because that material decomposed in that first year. Be prepared for that. And in subsequent years, you might need to come back in and amend the soil with more organic matter to take into account the decomposition that's going to happen. And so to also help eliminate some of those air spaces, during the process of filling with those logs and those branches, I'll go ahead and take some soil and put it in from the very beginning to fill as many of the gaps as possible. Now, the soil you use in the bottom half does not have to be good amended soil. You can use the native soil like I have, which is deficient in the nutrients. In fact, that poor soil actually works very well with the nutrients that are going to be released into the future. And so you're improving your poor soil by mixing it with all of this buried organic material. Periodically, I get into the bed and use my feet to help distribute some of this material, especially the soil, so that I fill as many of the crevices as I can. If you don't have a lot of big logs and branches, but you have things like pine needles and leaves, you can use those. That's what I did in this area. I started running out of the bigger logs and bigger branches, and so I took a lot of the pine needles that I had and went ahead and poured those in as the base layer. As you continue this process of adding the logs and the branches and the twigs and the soil and more branches and more soil, as you get closer to the top, consider adding biochar or a slow-release organic fertilizer. Those are the kind of things that when the roots actually grow down deep enough, the soil already is nutrient rich. Now, if you're planning on filling with a really good nutrient-rich soil, you can bypass that step. As I approach that point where I'm going to be filling with good soil, I begin adding leaves and grass clippings. I know they're going to break down relatively quickly, so I know that those nutrients are going to be released into the soil faster than the logs and the branches. Once you get to that 8 to 15 inches from the surface that you're planning to plant in, then you can begin filling the rest of the bed with good amended soil. If you have the time, you can continue with Hugelkultur pretty much all the way to the top and just cover it with a very light layer of soil. But I like to get started planting right away. And so these beds have good soil in that top portion so that I can grow right away. And I'm allowing time for the bottom portion to decompose and gradually release all of those nutrients. The idea is to build a healthy soil environment from the bottom and the top. All of this fill that we're putting in is building the soil over a long period of time from the bottom. And by using organic mulches on top to include layers of compost, we're building the soil from above. And then the earthworms and all the soil microorganisms begin incorporating all of that organic matter and really making a thriving, living soil. And that's when plants do best. You can fill your beds with great soil, but unless you have that life within the soil, your plants won't do as well as they could. So by doing a system like this with all of the organics and allowing it to develop over time, you're really going to be building a successful garden environment. There's a lot more information I have about soil and beds, and I encourage that you watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.